Hi, we move into 1 Samuel 22 today as David continues to seek refuge from Saul, who's pursuing him wherever he can find him. And as we'll see today, the beginning of rumors and communications that indirectly show both Saul where David is, David where Saul is, and other people where they are, really takes off in this section. And we have to wonder what's going on behind the scenes that enables people in these distant places to know what's happening to our main characters. But before we get to that, let's situate our current passage in the larger structure. We've been following this chiastic structure of 1 Samuel 15 to 31, and we're now in this purple section here, chapter 21 to 23. David fleeing to King Achash of Gath last time, and that's paralleled with him among the Philistines with King Achash in 27. And we also saw a little bit last time how that'll eventually lead to the Philistines rejecting him down here, echoing, as we saw in the light blue part up here, his rejecting in symbolic ways the Philistines by defeating them. So we're in this section right here, and we've been looking at these scenes, and we'll note a difference between what we're seeing today is that chapter 21 had two relatively long scenes. The conversation between David and Ahimelech, interrupted only by the narrator's notice that Doeg, the Edomite, was there. And then the 6 verses between David and Achish, although David doesn't say anything, he just scratches the door and then drools his spittle down his face before Achish sends him away, almost, as we'll see. But today in these 5 verses, there's suddenly 3 scenes that cover quite a bit of ground. So the narrator is showing in quick succession how David is struggling to find a place of safety both for himself and for his family, and at the same time trying to gather an alternative network that can become an army for him, and they will make him their leader, their Tsar, as we'll see, and that will really definitively set up the reality that he's leading a band that is not Saul's band, not the army of Benjamin or even potentially of Israel, although it's not always called that. And so we'll see him move quite a bit around here, and then next time we'll get returned to Saul as he turns paranoid against the Benjaminites, his own people, and Doeg returns with the Ahimelech. So we've been looking at some questions that render this section challenging. And now we're down to this right here where I was. Why did David hide in the cave of Adullam, which we'll get to in a moment? And then I was hinting at how are all the locations and intentions being conveyed to others? And then why does he go to Mizpah of Moab? And who is the prophet Gad? And when is Gad told to go to the land of Judah? Does he go in the forest of Hereth? So we'll deal with all those issues today. And on that note of rumors and communication, we see that right here in the very first verse. David left there, which is to say Gath, and escaped to the cave of Adullam, which I'll show you in a moment, when his brothers and all his father's house heard of it. Well, how in the world would they have heard of it? Let's look at the atlas just for a moment to situate this. So his family presumably in their home of Bethlehem here, and David has just been here in Gath. Adullam, which is one of the only places in today's text that we actually have a reasonable geographic location for. It's also mentioned in Genesis 38 as a place where Tamar fools her father-in-law Judah into getting her pregnant. And so we know that's a known place archaeologically. Some of these others are not so clear. So the distance from Bethlehem to Adullam is not all that far, but it's certainly a good day's journey. But how, we don't hear that anybody is with David in Gath when he goes to Adullam. So how is this message getting back to Bethlehem so that his brothers and father's house all heard of it and come down there, all within one verse? We have no idea how that's happening, but it's certainly implying that despite the fact that in 2 scenes ago, Ahimelech saw David as alone, and it only says David left there, and there's no evidence there's anybody with him until the next verse, clearly there has to be somebody, or there's no way this message would have gone back and forth. So the text isn't telling us everything about what's going on, and that's key. No text can tell us everything. Obviously, if someone simply said, "What did you do today?" well, it would probably take all day to tell it. So we all edit and sort out what we want to say, usually unconsciously. So there's no illusion that this is telling us what David had for breakfast that day or all the details. But it's certainly leaving a big hole in here of how this essential communication, no small detail, not like what he had for breakfast or didn't, but how word is spreading around this whole region here of the politics between Saul and David. So we don't have an answer to that, but we know that's an important piece of what's going on here. So we saw the last thing was Achish asking these questions. Do I need more madmen? Shall this fellow come to my house? And we see no response either from Achish or the servants of Achish or of David. But somehow he just leaves there. So presumably he sees this drooling, scratching madman and just walks away, and David manages to leave as quickly as he got there. And it says that he escaped here, echoing what we saw in 1910. And we're going to see that theme of escape as a key word spread out here. It's not concentrated in one place, but it's certainly spread out through these 3 chapters through chapter 23, and we'll see a little more of it later. To the cave of Adullam. And the word Mara means cave, although it can also imply any place of hiding, although historically there's an understanding of a particular cave of Adullam, as you can see from this picture from the 19th century, at least a traditional sense of it. And Adullam as a place, as I note on my map here, is known. You can see it from above here, from this aerial view, and then the close-up here of that green forested place there on the hill. So somewhere in that region, not too far from Gath, and that seems to be the point, that he's just run quickly away from the Philistines and taken the first place he can go to. But very soon he's going to make a much greater journey. So notice here it's his brothers and his father's house heard of it. In verse 3, when he gets to the king of Moab, he'll ask about my father and mother. We'd last seen his brothers back in 1720, and it wasn't so good then. The brothers are the ones that thought the little David was getting his nose into the business where he had no place to be. And so David did not necessarily have a good relationship with his elder brothers, but he's gotten message of them. Presumably they didn't find out about it any other way than David conveying a message. So all his father's house, and we don't know how extensive that is. Normally this phrase, the bet ab in Hebrew, would mean all your relatives, but we don't hear anything else besides David's mother and father and his little literal brothers to know how far that would extend. But that would imply certainly the entire house of David is leaving Bethlehem for fear of Saul and now following David. So they went down there to him in this cave of Adullam. And then in verse 2, we hear something very, very important that's very easy for readers to skip over, but it's so key to everything that follows about who David is. And we see everyone repeated 3 times here in a rhythmic cadence in the Hebrew, Bakal Ish, all the men who are in distress, all the men who are in debt, all the men who are discontented gathered to him. It's quite a programmatic statement there, and we need to look more closely at the details. First of all, who are all these men in this area? Are they in distress and debt and discontented because of the Philistines, or because of Saul, or because of something else? Are they just people left out in the game of power and they perhaps landless? Let's look more closely at each of the words so we can see what it's trying to tell us in the original Hebrew. So the word for distress here, matzak, is a Deuteronomistic historian's word. We see it several times in Deuteronomy, and it's also in Jeremiah. Let's look at one so we can hear the kind of situations it's implying here. So in the desperate straits to which the enemy reduces you, you will eat the fruit of your womb and the flesh of your own sons. That's pretty desperate when you're going to survive by cannibalizing your own children. Everyone who's in debt, Noshe here, it's only one other time in the Deuteronomistic history. Is that because debt is important? I doubt it. It's because the authors of these stories aren't so much concerned with the debtors. They're more concerned with kings and the elite. The only place we hear any concern about that is in Nehemiah 5:7 in the post-exilic period. Let's look at that briefly. And he says, this is Nehemiah speaking in the first person, after thinking it over, I brought charges against the nobles and the officials, and I said to them, you are all taking interest from your own people. And they have nothing to say about that, because obviously they have been, but he tells them to stop doing that. So certainly that implies what's the obvious, that the 1%, as we might say these days, are holding the 99% in debt, whether that's over debts on land as agricultural people who would threaten to lose their land if they couldn't pay off, or on farm equipment, so to speak, of chariots or wagons or animals, we don't know. But there are certainly people who are in debt. And then everyone who's discontented is a generic term here, literally mar nefesh, the bitter souls or bitter lives, recalling Hannah in the beginning of 1 Samuel and also seen in Judges. So these are the outcasts, the marginalized that are bring in. And that's often how revolutions start. And I've tried throughout to liken the parallel between David's rise and the parallel of Vito Corleone, as you can see from this classic image from Godfather 2, where he begins to gather people like him that become the gang that becomes one of the leading mobster gangs of New York. Similarly, from a different tone, we might look here at George Washington gathering his troops and recognize that when the colonies took off against England, they were doing the same kind of thing. They were building an alternative group among people who were in distress, who were literally in debt, which was one of the main causes, as you know, even if you don't know a lot about U.S. history, but you might know about the Boston Tea Party and the issue of British taxation. So people were in debt and bitter over the oppression of the British. And certainly that's what Jefferson tried to make permanent for history in the Declaration of Independence, perhaps in a rhetorical way that might or might not reflect reality, but similarly here. So whether it's the founding of the United States as a rebellious group against the King of England, or the mafia of Vito Corleone against the Black Hand establishment of Sicily, here we see David doing a similar thing against the establishment of Saul, gathering people to him, and he became captain over them. The word Tsar here, and we'll look at that word in just a moment, but notice not king. He has no sense of being king over them, but being captain. And Tsar, we've seen used as the people who lead armies. So Sisera for an enemy army, but Abner for Saul's army a couple of times. And exactly as we saw in 1813, what Saul appoints David to become, the commander of the army, and similarly commanders of the Philistines' army. So this band officially, and I put that in quotes because the word Tsar is sometimes simply translated as officials, but here it plainly means a military leader in a context where there's not necessarily military hierarchy. So not captain as like in the U.S. hierarchy where a captain is above a lieutenant, below a major, but simply the leader of the army. And those with him numbered about 400, which is a pretty good group. And what we can infer from verse 2 that this didn't happen overnight. So even though the text is moving us quickly through David's travels through several places, plainly we have to understand that he spent some time here in this cave gathering people, and the word spread, and how those 400 survived in this cave and what they ate and where they slept, we don't know. But now he's got this band, and we'll see pretty soon it'll expand to at least 600. But from there he makes an amazing journey from Mizpah of Moab all the way over to here. And as you can see from this picture of Google Maps, which puts a location there, although archaeologists highlight that we really aren't sure where Mizpah is. The Kir Hareshesh is on my map there is one possibility, and that's what Google Maps is showing us. But plain, that's a long journey, and although my Bible map shows the journey down south around the Dead Sea, Google Maps shows it north. Either way, that's in a tremendously long journey. But what the point is, he's trying to get completely away from the possibility that Saul could get to his family. But going to the king of Moab, what are we going to make about that? So we have to look carefully at a couple of the details here. So as my note here says, we don't know whether the 400 went with him or not. It just says David went, and the purpose there is to deposit his parents there. So he's going to leave from that time. So we don't know whether the 400 came or not. Again, Mizpah is never seen anywhere else, the references to it not connected with Moab. So we really don't know if that's the place. But certainly Moab is on the other side of the Dead Sea. So either way. But the king of Moab, this recalls 12:9. And let's look back at that for a moment to see how shocking this is. So the narrator tells us they forgot Yahweh their God, and he sold them into the hand of Sisera, commander of the army of King Jabin of Hazor, and into the hand of the Philistines, and into the hand of the king of Moab, and they fought against them. So in other words, the Moabs are their enemies that the text is suggesting God has put on them as a punishment for their violations. But as my note below suggests, Saul's enemies must be David's friends. And my note goes on to suggest something else about this that we have to at least bring up, even though the text doesn't. Because according to the book of Ruth, which in the canonical order of the book is just before the first book of Samuel. So if you're beginning the first book of Samuel, the previous page's last word was David. And 2 verses before that, we see this in the end of the narrative. The women of the neighborhood gave him a name, which is to say the son of Ruth, saying, a son has been born to Naomi, because Naomi was there to be the nurse to the Moabite Ruth's baby. They named him Obed, and he became the father of Jesse, the father of David. End of the book of Ruth. So according to the book of Ruth, Jesse comes from Obed, and they are Moabites. But the book of 1 Samuel knows nothing about that, and almost certainly the case that Ruth is written later. Let alone the story in Genesis 19 that the Moabites came out because of the drunken incest between Lot and his daughter. Certainly there's nothing about the Moabites and the Ammonites here connected to that story, the Genesis story, is certainly later. So we don't have the negative association with Moab from that, or the positive association with Ruth, but we do have the sense that Moab was the enemy of Israel, and now David is trying to deposit his family safely there. And that's adjacent, of course, to his own attempt to find shelter among the Philistines, which failed. But we don't hear what the king of Moab has to say when David asks him, "Please let my father and mother," only time we hear about his mother, "come to you until I know what God will do for me." Notice it's not Yahweh here, although Elohim is used a number of times in 1 Samuel, so I'm not sure there's any theological significance of that. Or literally will make for me, as Edelman notes, or to be understood as a ruse to secure his parents from reprisal by Saul. So trying to set up in the mind of the king of Moab that David has some protection from God. And we don't hear a word from the king of Moab, just like we didn't hear a response from King Achish, but we hear he left them with the king of Moab, or literally, as my note below says, he led them to the face of the king of Moab, which makes it more personal than we see here. And they stayed with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. But what is the stronghold? Is that in Mizpah or somewhere else? The word for stronghold here, Metsudah, is used a number of times. It's first here, and the verses in the English and the Hebrew are off a little bit, so we have to note that. But it'll be used a number of times, and the word doesn't necessarily refer to a specific place, although the article "the" is often associated with it. But it really means something like the fortress or the place of safety, wherever that might be. It's not describing so much a specific place, but just the place where he was safe. So whether that's in Moab or back in Adullam, we don't know. He's going to end up in another verse over here in the forest of Heth, if the forest of Hereth is there, which we don't know either. But before we get that, we have another surprising thing that happens. Seemingly out of nowhere, then the prophet Gad said to David, and we have to go as readers, wait a minute. Who's the prophet Gad? Presented like we know him, but of course we don't know him. Gad is only mentioned here and near the very end of 2 Samuel. The name Gad is also one of the tribal names from the son of Jacob and Zilpah, but plainly that's not what's at issue here. Prophets earlier, we've seen Samuel is a prophet back in chapter 3 and in chapter 9, and we've seen twice the wandering bands of prophets, the ones that Saul encountered when he was looking for the seer early on, and the one in chapter 19 where the question raised was, is Saul numbered among the prophets? But their prophets weren't speaking truth. Their prophets were engaging in some kind of mystical frenzy that put them into the Spirit of God, and they threw off their clothes and were naked, but they didn't necessarily provide any kind of word from Yahweh to anybody, as the classic prophets do that we know from the biblical books named for them, like Isaiah and Jeremiah, etc. But what we're beginning to see is that kings have prophets. And when David is settled as king, his prophet will be Nathan. We're not sure where he comes from. And royal prophets are going to come in two categories. The kind of yes men that are enjoy being members of a royal cabinet and having the authority there, and those like Jeremiah or Micah, who dare to challenge kings, even if it puts them, as it does with Jeremiah, thrown down the well and left for dead. So the question of whether kings can trust prophets in the royal household is one we have to continue to look at, as opposed to prophets who don't work for the king, like Elijah and Elisha, and are pursued by kings because they're speaking Yahweh's word against the king's oppression or abuse of their people. But we know nothing about this prophet Gad. He just shows up out of nowhere and says to David, notice he doesn't say in the name of Yahweh. He doesn't say Yahweh told me to tell you. There's no sense that this is a sacred word. If we infer that, it's simply because it's coming from the mouth of someone the narrator calls a prophet. But that's an inference that we can draw or not draw. And maybe it's just his personal advice. Do not remain, or literally do not settle, in the stronghold. Leave and go into the land of Judah. Why? He doesn't say because Saul is coming or any particular reason. He just says it. The land of Judah, of course, this place is a very vague description. We can't expect it as a place with boundaries and borders and now entering the land of Judah, nor is the land of Israel under Saul something clear. We're just seeing it's really just this small area here. And if we were to go up the map to some of the more traditional areas, including what's now known as Galilee or Samaria, none of that is part of what's at issue. It's all in this small area here. So the land of Judah is a very vague vague description, but it's the first time here that Judah is referred to as a land. And two possibilities there, as my note below suggests. Does it suggest a connection with king of the land, which is what the servants of Achish referred to David as? Or is it an alternative to Saul's control over Benjamin? We'll see in the next scene that Saul has the Benjaminites around him. So as Halpern has suggested, the Judah as a nation is perhaps something that David actually made up, and we'll see more of that later. But here it is back earlier in the story. And David doesn't question Gad or say a word to him any more than the king of Moab said a word to David. These are not conversations. These are somebody saying something and the other person just responding. But he does what Gad says, and he left, and he interprets the land of Judah as going to the forest of Hereth. Now, again, my map has it here, but we really don't know. There's no clarity of where that is. But it's the second time we're hearing of forest. We heard of a forest back in chapter 14, and we'll hear of a forest of Ephraim in chapter 18 in 2 Samuel. But we really know nothing about this place, and the location is unknown. So quickly, David has gone from Gath to this cave in Adullam, all the way across to Mizpah of Moab, and now has come back to here. And finally, immediately we hear Saul heard that David and those with him had been located. So despite David's sense of trying to move around and listen to a prophet who hopefully was giving a word of safety, it's all come to Saul, and we'll have to see what Saul does with that word next time. See you then.